The talk today is going to look at how enthusiasm for sport and cartoons or other areas of interest can invite people into exploring their local history and heritage. So I'm going to use some personal interests of mine, such as sport, and looking at local clubs and stories from a historical viewpoint. Before we go any further, there is a public service announcement. There will be plenty of references to Mount Sion and soccer over the course 30 minutes or so you have been warned. A thought to be kept in mind during the presentation in relation to encouraging those of all ages and backgrounds to pursue an interest in history and heritage are to paraphrase the words of William Butler Yeats. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this quote, that education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. And I'd certainly feel that about history as a subject, that it should be a fire, it should be a passion. So let's not settle for the rehashing of tales about great white men of history. So let's encourage people to explore stories that speak to them. So be it subjects like gardens, gardeners, shopkeepers, hurlers, musicians, or even the odd chancer or two. Let's ignite people's passions on the subject of history. So with that in mind, to evoke the soulful tones of Philadelphia's finest, the Tramps, with the command of Disco Inferno, Burn Baby Burn. I imagine you didn't expect some 70s, 80s music to be mentioned this early on. I'm also conscious that Joanne and Caroline would like today's event to be conversational and an exchange of ideas, so we'll have time for a chat at the end. I just want to note as well, and my mother may disagree with this, that I'm not the preserve of all knowledge, but I'm using my own interest and experience for ideas that may encourage others. If there's anyone who would like to chat at some time but feels a bit shy or uncomfortable today, I'll give out my email address at the end if anyone would like to chat down the line. As my slideshow has stopped. This is exciting now. No pressure here. I think I'll have to start singing. I appear to be having a slight issue with the slideshow, which I'll give up on in a moment, and we can go back to my ugly head then. Right, so having a bit of trouble with my slide, but anyway, we'll persevere. So the talk itself is broken down into to three parts, really. The first part is me kind of outlining a rough philosophy on my own belief in history, while the second is followed by some practical examples from my own experience. And you can see that it's a constant process of development, that it doesn't just end at a particular point, that it's sort of an up and down curve, just like anyone's interests. And the third part then would be looking at some history and heritage heroes of mine, so people I'd look up to and follow, be it on things like Twitter, Facebook, and in traditional media then, like newspapers and journal articles. So I believe our first slide here would have had Sean done. I believe history as a passion should be used to explore the universality of human experience. There are common threads to any story, things like love, loss, fortune, or even failure. To look at factors such as environment, timing, international events, but you can actually look at it from a different angle or with a local spin. So it brings me to the words of the late Mount Sion and Waterford poet Sean Dunn and his poem Letters to Lisbon. You may be familiar with the lines, "I have given up doubt, that old worn out coat. All that's constant is the fact of change. Pearl of love, grit of pain." I myself believe that history is that coat that Dunn is referring to, and there's a perfect fit for everyone. We should encourage a variety of interests. If we all wear the same old tan mac, which some of us can do, we create a dull sphere for people to dip their toe into local history and heritage. So it's like anything, everyone is passionate about it here, but we have to try and get other people to recognise what a lovely subject it can be. So again, most stories, to quote Dunn, either have a pearl of love or a grit of pain, like the theatre has a fine line between comedy and tragedy. So with that in mind, you could look at topics with a distinct local flavour, or local dimension. For those of us from Waterford City, you could call it a blangle, a bla angle. I'm waiting for the drummer to come in there with the cymbal. I'll copyright that bla angle in time. So history is essentially the study of chance and circumstance. And I believe all history is local and local to someone. I always think of the dulcet tones of Clydebank's Marty Pellow. History is all around us. And again, if Tracy would like to join in on the backing vocals there, we might get a sing-song at the end for any wet, wet, wet fans. So even with great events, there are national, that be they national or international, are rooted in the local. Sometimes we have to remove ourselves and try and look at a story concerning a local dimension with objectivity, not just for balance, but more so to really realise its significance in the first place. So sometimes we think just because it happened in Ballybricken or Ballybeg or Ballysaggart that we tend to sort of keep it on the low, whereas we should really realise that these stories are very important. It brings to mind the words of Patrick Kavanagh. I'm sure you're all aware of his 1960 poem Epic, with the lines, "Till Homer's ghost came whispering to my mind. He said I made the Iliad from such a local row. Gods make their own importance." And that last line is really the refrain for today's talk, about gods make their own importance. So if you have an interest or passion in a particular subject, it's that idea that there's a stocking for every shoe. There's an aspect of history for every person, be it criminal, musical, economic, social, local, maritime, digital humanities. There's something for everyone. And it's just to allow people to realise that it's there to be accessible and it's not the preserve of anyone. So the biggest thing is to take the leap and explore your local history and heritage. You may find a row like the one that inspired Homer all those years ago. We then turn to myself. I had named slide 4 the narcissistic slide. Could well be considered a therapy session. So if anything, I'll have to pay Joanne and Caroline to listen to my life story and troubles here. Essentially, I'm trying to demonstrate how my own background and interests have played a huge part in my research and writing. I attended Mount Sion Primary School on Barrack Street, hence the Barrack Street tuxedo I'm wearing at the moment, in Waterford City. And 2002 was a major year in the history of the school as it celebrated its bicentenary. So there was awareness of the history that surrounded us, from Blessed Edmund Ignatius Rice to the old school buildings such as the tailors and the bakery, to the monastery with the Harry Clark Company designed stained glass windows. So when you're in an environment where you're surrounded by a depth of history, how it's like osmosis almost, you pick up on it. Aside from this, the school also cultivated pupils' interests with their annual projects competition. So this took place for those between the ages of 8 and 12, from 2nd to 6th class. And basically after Christmas, over the course of 8 weeks, students will work on a project of their choosing and will be submitted just after St. Patrick's Day. So sort of from a young age, being in that process of every year trying to look up something to display a project on, it nearly becomes habit forming. And when you enjoy something then from an early age, it's very hard to move away from it. So it was very pivotal in my later studies and subsequent career then. Offhand projects I've completed included Egypt, classics of children's literature, history of Native Americans, a study of religion, and a history of popular music. So in one sense, you could say in the space of 5 years, I went from Queen Nefertiti to Queen's Freddie Mercury. Now, I'm not sure who was more flamboyant, but we'll keep that for another day. As I said already, it definitely served as a wonderful foundation for my 2nd and 3rd level studies. From receiving guidance and skill set from teachers, and particularly from Principal Declan Foley at the time. You probably all know Declan, he's the father of Cian Foley, and would be involved in the Waterford Male Voice Choir. That there was an emphasis on research, and particularly researching something that was of interest to the pupil, and an eye for display. So it was even presenting things for kids at a youthful age. It was a good foundation for what I've then pursued. As most people know, I have an addiction to sport. So if anything that involved a ball, or even if it's two flies crawling up a wall, I'd enjoy watching it for the sort of competitive nature. So 2002 was the perfect year to fall in love with sport. From a Waterford perspective, you had Waterford Crystal won the National Basketball Championships. Of course, anyone who was a hurling fan will well remember Waterford won their first Munster Championship in 39 years. And of course, you had the machinations, politics, and recriminations of the FIFA World Cup and the real civil war saipan, were you for Mick McCarthy or Roy Keane. Now, because it's Tuesday and conscious of trying to keep things civil, because it's so early in the week, we won't discuss saipan any further, but we'll all agree that Mick McCarthy was right. Of course, the same day that Brazil won their record 5th World Cup, Waterford made their provincial breakthrough. And it got me looking again at the words of the legendary Con Houlihan, who wrote 3 times, 3 cheers are due for Waterford. They won their World Cup on Sunday, or if you like, they won their Cup of the World. So again, it's going back to Patrick Kavanagh again, gods make their own importance. So be it celebrating with a samba in Rio de Janeiro or honouring in County Fort Lariga, we again echo those words of Patrick Kavanagh, gods make their own importance. Oftentimes it is our interest that guides the significance that is attached to an event, be it in our family, local and national histories and stories. So for me, everything that I've researched, written or spoken about can be traced back to that one year in 2002, with my main interest being Mount Sion, Waterford and sport. Now I'll admit it wouldn't be great conversation topics over a pint, but that's my gravy, as they say. Now, I'm sure Freud and Jung would have had a field day trying to analyse my chase to reclaim an almost perfect year. Psychoanalysis aside, these were the experiences that went towards fueling my passion and interest, which I pursue till this day. So the next part then, we've had a little bit of theory and sort of where my own interests come from in those early years at Mount Sion and how they've kind of developed further in sort of my early or late teenage, early young adult years then. So an example of this, of how my interests have governed my research and how I was able to put my research and writing skills into practice, was with Cork City in the League of Ireland. So any Waterford FC fans, you can keep the booing for Friday for Longford Town. Don't aim it at me. A lot of my involvement in writing articles for Cork City's matchday programme, City Edition, was down to my circumstances at the time. I was living in Cork and attended games with my friends, of course, and we may have had a pint or two, which made things even more interesting aside from the games. And it reawakened my interest in all things League of Ireland, which my dad, Ali, cultivated by bringing me to the RSC every wet Thursday evening to see Waterford United. There was never any sun back then. It was a tough childhood trying to support Waterford United in the rain. So however, with my interest reawakened when I was in college in Cork, so arose the opportunity with Cork City. Thanks to the kindness and support of club administrator Aina Buckley, it was an experience that lasted 3 years. It encompassed about 30 articles which covered subjects such as the original Cork City in the 1930s. That article was entitled Back to the Future, which I thought was cool at the time, probably not. The glorious era of Cork United in the 1940s, who dominated the League of Ireland. Some of you of a mature vintage will then remember the stories of Cork Hibs and Cork Celtic, as well as looking at Cork's record in European competition. I'd like to just have a little break for a second, just to highlight, I'd be very modest about my achievements, but I would like to take credit for inspiring the club to the league and cup double in 2017. Obviously, some of the players read the articles I wrote, were inspired by it, and even if the players didn't read it, I'm still taking credit a la Jose Mourinho. So that's just a little bit of modesty there for myself. I wouldn't be unique in having an interest in the history of the League of Ireland. You can see loads of people across the island have a similar interest. People like Johnny Ward, who some of you may know from the Irish Independent, a great man for giving a tip on a horse. Johnny's a big Galway United fan, and before he started his career in journalism, contributed to the Galway Matchday programme. You also have someone like MacDara Farish, some of you will know from independent.ie, an Extra Time, big Shamrock Rovers fan, connection with Finn Harps too, again has a great passion for the League of Ireland. And there's also Gerald Farrell of Bohemians, who I believe is a historian in residence in Dublin, as well as having his own successful podcast then, looking at all things League of Ireland and social history of Dublin. So it would be fair to say that our interest in the history of the league is again a nod to the words of the late great Con Houlihan, who composed the following, no doubt, on butcher's paper. The proliferation of soccer in this island is about the best thing that has happened to us since the arrival of the potato. Now, I'm sure Sir Walter Raleigh would be disappointed with a comment like that, but he's not here to give out, or if he is, I have some questions for him about that bypass and you all. It may well be hyperbole from Con Houlihan, but anyone that has a passion in the League of Ireland would believe that it's pretty accurate, that quote. We can, through sports history, we can look at complicated subjects such as identity, class structures, politics, culture, but there always being more to the scoreline than meets the eye. That's why we think of famous films or shows like Friday Night Lights, Field of Dreams, Moneyball, or if you're into a bit of sex, drugs, rock and roll, the Salacious Dream Team, which was on Sky One. It's not always about what's on the field, but what happens in the stand and outside the stadium. That's very important and interesting. And again, you'll be bored to hear of the refrain, gods make their own importance. So my interest then obviously was reawakened, and then I practiced looking at researching subjects and presenting topics during those 3 years with Cork City, and it was developed further with Pog Mo Goal. And if anyone's familiar with it, Pog Mo Goal was set up around Euro 2012, and it was to try and look at soccer from a slightly different perspective, with the use of design and art to explore different angles than we may have been previously used to, particularly in Ireland. And it's that thing, it's a great community as well, that everyone wants to share a little nugget of knowledge that they found. So to share with people that have the same passion then is really reaffirming. The Pog Mo Goal website, which has now developed into a magazine, was established by Key Carew and his brother James, two Kilkenny men, so you wouldn't expect soccer aficionados in a hurling stronghold. And Key has described the Pog Mo Goal magazine as a global magazine with Irish roots and treats the game here the same as we do the game in Germany, the USA or Brazil. It's a publication focused on considered design and great quality writing from around the globe. So those of you who don't have an interest in sport are probably going, consider design and quality writing are not words you'd associate with sport or soccer history. But Pog Mo Goal tries to take a different angle. So here we can see a melting pot concerning design, so presentation, culture, football history, and Irish history. So not only do we have art collectives like Ruckspiel, who will be an Austrian art collective, who have designed the interior for Adidas in Vienna, but we also have Irish historians such as Donald Fallon, who you'd all know from the Three Castles Burning podcast, as well as RTE's National Treasures, and Waterford's own David Toms, who I'm sure you all know from his history of soccer in Munster, as well as his poetry endeavours as well. So it's really just trying to look at a familiar subject, but doing things slightly differently. From my own experience with both the website and the written publication, I've tried to look at topics that interested me at a particular time. So one example is when I was in Cork, I researched a story called The Curious Case of the Cork Atletic Committee Member 1953. And you're probably wondering, well, how could that be interesting? So Cork Atletic reached the 1953 FAI Cup final, and it goes to a replay. However, the day before the replay, a number of the team have to go to court to give evidence, as one of the committee members is up for attempted murder. So we can agree, not good preparation if you're going for a cup final, but a very serious topic, and it looks at issues about how women were treated in the 1950s. And if you look at the testimony of the victim, it's it's a horrible story that shows how insignificant sport is, but through the sport and the topic, we're able to look at difficult subjects such as that. Another one would be Mullinavat's Matt O'Mahony. That primarily arose through me having a lot of cousins in Mullina, Vegas. Matt O'Mahony was a Kilkenny soccer pioneer, so he would have been the last Kilkenny man to have played international soccer for the FAI before Shawnee Maguire in recent years. So I'm sure you'd all remember Shawnee from playing for Waterford United in the RSC. He was famously quipped to be just as good as Lionel Messi when the club sold him to West Ham United. But we never heard of Lionel Messi ever again. The last one I'd like to give then, as an example, is of Dungarvan's Dennis Kelleher. So Dennis Kelleher was from Dungarvan. He was capped 8 times at amateur level. He actually served in the British Army during the Second World War and managed to escape from Nazi Germany. He played for Great Britain at the Olympic Games, and he later became a folk hero at Barnet. So in actual fact, when he escaped from Nazi Germany, he came back through Sweden, and when he arrived in England the following day, he scored 2 goals to win a match for Barnet. So again, it shows how at those different times, those subjects sort of arose because I was living in Cork. I wanted to write something that my cousins in Mullinavat would be interested in, and then look at a story of a Dungarvan man or an Irish man abroad, looking at subjects like the Irish diaspora and how he's sort of been forgotten over time, as tends to happen. So again, it's looking at how a personal interest can change and develop over time, and it's changing as much as I'm learning. It's a constant process, it's a dialogue, it's a conversation. If we go back to Disco Inferno, it's a fire which needs to be fueled. So it's very much, you have to have that passion and encouragement when delving into subjects like this that you have an interest in. My next slide was going to be the MacGuffin slide, and it was about Celtic Squash Club and Muhammad Ali. So again, the squash club itself is at the end of Barrack Street on Norris's Corner. I would have been playing a lot of squash at the time and just decided to look into the history of the club. So it was a great Waterford nursery. It was established in 1974 by Bobby Phelan, who you'd all probably remember also owned Norris's. There was a lovely interaction on Twitter before today's talk with Julie Ward, who spoke about her connection with the squash club, her dad being the founder of it. With the establishment of that club, it matched a boom in the sport in the early 1970s in Ireland. So to put that into context, there was actually 7,000 squash players on the island with 90 courts across the land. And then looking at the success of that Waterford club, between 1974 to 1986, Celtic or Celtic Squash Club won 12 Munster titles in a row. In 1981, the club won their first All-Ireland Championship and were the first club outside Belfast and Dublin to do so. They would go on to win 7 All-Irelands in total. So from researching this short 2,000-word piece on the history of the club, my interest was further piqued by seeing the name Muhammad Ali involved at the Waterford Glass Invitational. So of course my interest was piqued. Muhammad Ali, it's hardly the Muhammad Ali, but it was something that captured my attention that I felt I had to sort of research and investigate further. So here we have an example of how a local project on a local club who had great figures like John Phelan, Peadar Kavanagh, Jack Laffin, Richie Power were all Irish internationals. Jack Laffin had a Guinness World Record for a continuous squash for 24 hours. Richie Power was Irish #1. He won he was the first man from outside Dublin or Belfast to win the All-Ireland Championship in singles and was a former League of Ireland soccer player. So moving aside from those great Waterford sports people, we then had Muhammad Ali. Now, you'd be disappointed to know that it isn't St. Louis, Kentucky's Muhammad Ali, the greatest boxer of all time. It was actually a Pakistani squash player whose full name was Muhammad Ali Samji. And this led me to research and write an article for History Ireland, which was entitled Contrary to Natural Justice, Muhammad Ali Samji and the Irish Nationality and Citizenship Act 1956. So just to give a flavour of that piece, which is available for free online, in the late 1970s, as I've already mentioned, the Irish squash rackets scene was very popular, but it was dominated by a Pakistani squash player named Muhammad Ali Samji, who harboured aspirations to represent Ireland in international tournaments. He was married to a native of Drogheda, and Samji was about to realise this ambition in 1979 when the eligibility rule was changed by the Irish Squash Rackets Association, the ISRA. So in a bid to save his hopes of playing international squash, he applied for Irish citizenship, but was denied it under the provisions of the Irish Nationality and Citizenship Act 1956. Consequently, Samji and his wife took a legal case in the High Court against the Minister for Justice and Attorney General in December 1979. National eligibility and residency rules are still a divisive subject in Irish sport today. Obviously, we look back to Jack Zeus, the granny rule for the Republic of Ireland national soccer team, to current Irish rugby squads, which have had South African and New Zealand-born players among their number. But it was in the minority sport of squash that the debate led to legal proceedings. So basically, without going into too much depth about it, under the law at the time, Samji wasn't entitled to Irish citizenship because he was married to an Irish woman, but it would apply the other way around in the sense that if a non-national, non-native was non-Irish person was married to an Irish male, they would be entitled to Irish citizenship. And basically in the debates in the Dáil and the judge's finding at the end of proceedings felt that the fact the stipulation wasn't there was an oversight, because essentially the male-dominated Dáil at the time that devised the legislation didn't countenance it, didn't foresee it happening. So if you'd like to read a little bit more about that, that's available online at History Ireland. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to let everyone know in the next edition of History Ireland, the September-October edition, I'll have an article in it on the Charters affair. So where this comes from is basically I became obsessed with Netflix crime series. So everything from Making a Murder as well as the West Cork podcasts. I say my parents were getting nervous there at one stage. I was watching so many crime series that I was trying to see if was there anything similar with a Waterford connection. So I came across the 1895 Valentine Charters murder trial, which was a landmark case in Canadian judicial history. It revealed inadequacies in the legal definitions of criminal responsibility and insanity, and because of political implications, reached into the highest offices of government. Waterford's Valentine Charters was the son of wealthy parents. In 1893, at the age of 18, he was sent to Montreal to learn to be independent of his overindulging mother. He obtained a secretarial position with the Montreal Cotton Company in Valleyfield, Quebec, but was soon dismissed. Charters' mother sent him money, but in January 1895, she wrote to him falsely stating that the family fortune had been lost and he would have to fend for himself. So a lot of people in a similar situation sort of realised they have no more money. Of course, the logical thing was to go and rob your former employer. It says a lot about Valentine. So on the 1st of March 1895, Charters tried to rob the Montreal Cotton Company's pay office, and he fatally shot clerk John Loy and watchman Maxine Leboeuf, and seriously wounded clerk Hugh Wilson. And to find out the interesting things about that case, then keep an eye out for History Ireland, the September-October edition. But again, it's an example of how just something that struck me last year, that I, as I said, kind of got obsessed with these crime series, piqued my interest to see what stories would come from Waterford. And here we have a case of Waterman in a landmark trial in Canada. It was actually the longest trial in Canada at that time. It lasted about 29 days altogether. And even some of the solicitors, lawyers, barristers came to Waterford to get testimony from local people about Valentine Charters. The next slide was an ode to Neil Diamond, keeping in that jukebox karaoke theme, and was about reaching out. So we'll keep Sweet Caroline for when we can all meet in person, but it's an example of how my own story has come full circle somewhat. Between 2016 and 2018, I decided to go back and visit my old primary school, Mount Sion, and with Miss Laura O'Brien, we devised a local history programme. So in 2016, we looked at things like the Easter Rising, but in the subsequent years, we looked at things more relevant to the students and to the area. So we spoke about Barrack Street, Ballybricken, the history of Waterford City and the school, and some notable students that attended Mount Sion. And we looked at culture at the time, so things that really got the students interested were sport. We talked about Jack Johnson and boxing. We looked at fashion. We looked at things like cinema as well, so there was something for everyone. Aside from this outreach with Mount Sion, myself and Bart Gosdoor, who you'll all know Bart as the Viking, the king of the Vikings, the only Viking left in the village, we devised an outreach programme which from 2017 to 2019 saw us visit again Mount Sion Primary School, St Mary's Ballygunner, and Passage East National School. So with both programmes, we decided to take on the role of facilitator rather than lecturer. So it was all about interaction, and it was all led by the students. So they drove the direction of the class by their questions and queries and what interested them. So an example from the one in Ballygunner with Bart as a Viking was this little girl asked him right at the end, did the Vikings have toys? And it was a perfect question in the sense of it was just coming up to Christmas. It really interested her, but you could see the question itself had been thought of by the other 60 children in the room, in the hall. And sometimes, as adults, we get overly serious looking at things, whereas that's a very important question to a child to learn, something that's relatable to them. And you could see immediately that it captured all their interests and their imagination was piqued. So it was just something really small, but how we can show that encouragement as well. So hopefully inspired them to look at such subjects later down the line. Again, with the Mount Sion Projects competition, which I spoke about earlier, the Waterford Archaeological and Historical Society have sponsored the Professor Seamus Pender Award for genealogy and local history. So I'm sure you're all aware of Professor Pender, again a Mount Sion man, who went to UCC. So it's just a way of marking a great proponent of history from the city, just from the Ella Road, I believe, and to get students to look at subjects such as their family history and local history. And the first year there were two great projects, one looking at the Collins brothers from Bolton Lane and the First World War, and there was a wonderful one on a boy called Lambert, who was a descendant of William Lambert or Lamport, the man we now know as Zorro. So again, you know, they're only 11 or 12 years of age, but their interest sort of stimulated the effort they put into the research and display. And for kids their age, it was remarkable. And then last year, obviously, I don't want to mention COVID-19 again, but I just have, with Colette Carney of the Mount Sion Choir fame, we put together an oral history project for first and second year students. So it kind of served a community purpose as well, because it got the kids to interact with older people who may have been finding the effects of the COVID-19 lockdown particularly difficult at that time, as well as interest in the students and how their grandparents would have lived. So we had a raft from students who had grandparents in Poland, Norway, America, to more local traditional stories as well. But again, for kids their age 13 and 14, it was a remarkable effort. And I'd like to note one student in particular. You're all probably aware Romeo and Juliet is on at the moment. But one of the performers in that show is a young man called Charlie Marr. And he would have been involved in both the Mount Sion projects, the Mount Sion Local History Programme and the Oral History Project. And really is a remarkable student who, remember the name, he'll go from Mount Sion to Hollywood for sure. So again, with all these projects, we should share our passion. That's what inspires. So again, we're probably all sick of infections and reproduction rates, but enthusiasm is infectious, and that's what we have to remember at the end of the day. If you have someone speaking with enthusiasm on a subject or on their interests, it's very hard not to be swept up by it. So aside from the theory, my own experience, I just point out I'm 27, so I really know nothing, but just share my own experience there. I'd just like to point out some history and heritage heroes who I follow online and who really inspire me to look at the subject in a different way. One of those is a man who needs no introduction, Andrew Doherty of Cheek Point, County Waterford, of Waterford Harbour, Tides and Tales. He's been writing his blog since 2014. He's very active with a wonderful Facebook page, also called Waterford Harbour, Tides and Tales. He's brought many maritime stories and historical facts about Cheek Point and the significance of Waterford's estuary, some of which are tales that have been given through him through working on the river shore alongside his elders when Cheek Point was a thriving fishing village. So I think Andrew does it in a wonderful way, that he looks at historical events while also looking at the local lore and dovetail them wonderfully together between history and memoir. And when you look at what he does on Facebook and Twitter, and aside from his own job and family and everything, it's amazing that he's cultivated almost this cult-like following. The Dotteryites, I think we should call them. So it's really that thing of community, and he's looking at the history of his community when it was a thriving fishing village. I think that's what it resonates with everyone then, that idea. So definitely, we're looking forward to hearing Andrew again, bringing out his third book, and on Sunday Miscellany as well. Another person who would follow Andrew in a similar way with their activity on Twitter and Facebook is Liam Cahill, a former Mount Sion man, former RTE journalist. Liam has a new book coming out in September, From Shore to Yarama, which follows the story of a young Irish volunteer, Mossy Quinlan, during his 83 days in the Spanish Civil War. And basically, Liam brings you along on the journey that Mossy followed at that time, about going undercover, training, eating, sleeping, fighting, until his heroic death in the Battle of Yarama, just outside Madrid. You'll learn about Mossy's life, his ideals, his beliefs, about growing up in Ireland at the time, and how he dealt with the gore of the Spanish battlefields. And he poses a wonderful question then at the end about, when heroes die, do they take a piece of their family with them? So again, Liam did something very interesting by, again, utilising a Facebook page to sort of highlight the historical events, but he also kind of gave us a little peek in behind the curtain, because he brought us through how his research was developing at the time. So what questions were arising from his research. So it was kind of like seeing into the mind of how someone goes about researching a subject and what questions resonate with them. And it was good sort of publicity as well for that book, which we, as I said, is available for pre-order. And finally, because I'm short of my slides, I'd like to also point out Anya Whelan. So, sometimes we tend to look to places like Germany or London or Dublin or America to see what's trendy and what's in fashion and for advice and who to follow. But we actually have people on our own doorstep who have the theory and the knowledge and are willing to share it. And one of them is Anya Whelan. Anya is a public historian with an MA in Public History and Cultural Heritage from the University of Limerick. And she has a fascinating article coming out, and a very important article in the next History Studies UL journal. And it's entitled Pushing the Boundaries of Public History in Ireland's Oldest City, Heritage, Tourism and the Future of Waterford's Viking Triangle as a Shared Cultural Resource. So again, it's that idea of history should be accessible to everyone, that everyone's interest should be sort of respected. It's not a meritocracy of kings and queens and then beggars at the bottom, but each story tells a tale. So to quote some of the lines from Anya's great article, she makes a nod to the words of Donald H. Sanders and says that past lives and events didn't happen in 2D. They were not static, segmented slices of time. So it's the idea of bringing it all back to life and making it relatable to everyone, be it a child who's 12 to someone who's in their 80s, that it should be accessible to everyone and anyone. It's not the preserve of a select few individuals. Anya, obviously, the article itself was born out of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and looking at the closure to heritage sites and cultural centres. She said, in the period where museums, galleries and heritage sites have been closed, we are reminded of the importance of the stories such places tell that connect people across time, space and nations. So again, it's that idea that we can all relate, and that it's almost like another language. It's I remember Paul Kimmage used to say about cycling that it was a wonderful passion, lovely pursuit, and that when more people discover it, they just can realise people's enthusiasm for it. And I think that's the same way with history. But most importantly, and probably the most important line from Anya's journal article, is heritage needs the community as much as the community needs heritage. So at the end of the day, it comes down to people. It comes down to simple things that an interesting story is good history, and it gets people involved. So through the effort of people like Dram Rockwell, Caroline Power, Tracy McEnany, Andrew Doherty, Ian Cahill, and think some of the younger crew like Cleena Purcell, who has an interest in gender and sexuality history and utilising new technologies in education. Shane Brown, who has a very interesting study coming out on the national volunteers and looking at, well, I have an admission here now. This is slightly salacious and I won't name the person, but I remember I was the editor of Daishi's journal in 2016, and I was speaking to one particularly noted historian who said there'd be no point in having anything about Waterford in the 1916 Rising because sort of nothing happened, and it's kind of, people would be fed up with it after the year. And I disagreed with that. I felt long-term people would have to look back at the journal and see that there was some analysis of Waterford's role. And I remember John Borgonovo saying just because something didn't happen doesn't lessen it. If anything, it's more interesting to find out how places can be different. Aside from that, Shane then with the volunteers has completed his PhD with UCD, and you can actually see some of his work with his blog online, which gives little tidbits. You may remember him having done the Ordinary Voices, Extraordinary Lives exhibition in the Bishop's Palace. And then there's also two Strap Valley historians, Cian Flaherty and Peggy Devlin. I know Joanne would know Cian Flaherty very well, an absolute brain of knowledge and a way of presenting things, probably a little bit more old school, same with Peggy. But again, it just shows that you have 4 or 5 people around the same age and all with different interests and different passion, but they share the same passion for history and for knowledge and for learning and developing their skills. In the blurb for today's talk, there was mention of cartoons, and as Joanne and Anya would know, my heart was broken over trying to develop this comic called Hoda. So we had some great people involved, like Andrew Doherty, James Doherty. We had a young student from the presentation, Eva Penkert, 12 years of age, who created her own comic strip looking at her family history involving an aircraft landing in 1943 along the Tramore Road, as well as Conor Donegan, who you may be aware is from Domar East, has previously written for the Daisy's Journal on naval warfare off the coast of Waterford. He's currently doing an MA on local elections in Waterford in the early 1920s, which he'll be completing this September. But again, we were trying to maybe, that famous 50 cent comment, the rapper, not the currency, of good artist copy, great artist steal. So we were trying to copy or steal a little bit of Pog Mo Goal, but with a more local Waterford history background. And it was all to go for a good cause with the local youth mental health charity, Lakes. Now, we encountered many problems with COVID, and we have some wonderful images from artists like Emma Pettit, Evelyn Suttle in Dublin, as well as Eva. My own father devised some wonderful maritime paintings and drawings. So we will get back on track with that. But we had great young people involved. Again, different interests, but had a passion. And hopefully that sort of passion and encouragement will see it over the line then. So I realise I've rambled there at breakneck speed for probably 30-40 minutes, and I'm going to shut up now and leave someone else say something. Like